trying to tell the story in the words of the people who basically were the major actors. It's an intellectual history of the idea of evolution, but particularly about the nature of species and how species evolve through natural means rather than supernatural means. The person that I learned was perhaps even more critical than anybody was Isaac Newton. He firmly believed that there was a natural causal explanation for absolutely every natural phenomenon that you could pinpoint, you could show, you could demonstrate.
The scriptural emphasis on the creation story in Genesis was a positive facilitator of modern geology in that respect, because it encouraged these early people in the 17th century and 18th century, encouraged them to think in terms of the historical development of the Earth, so that once they had also accepted the idea of a very long time scale, then you could have a very long history of the Earth. But it was a history. Earlier on, if you were going to be scientific about the Earth, you tended not to be historical. You were looking for timeless laws of nature.
The most important person that got the ball rolling for evolution was Lamarck, who was widely disparaged in our culture and in our times. When I read his 1801 book on invertebrates, he had a little section on fossils, and he said that 3% of the species that he knows as fossils are still alive today off the coast. His colleague at the Jardin des Plantes was Cuvier, and Cuvier was very important for many reasons, but one of the most important ones was he was convinced of the reality of extinction, to the point where he said that absolutely no animals that you find as fossils, animals or plants, are still alive today. Lamarck said no, only 3% of my things are still alive, but it's not because they went extinct, it's because they slowly changed into the species that we have today. And also he said, and if you look hard enough and you go laterally, geographically, you'll see them also graded. And so what we're missing is data that shows what the intermediate steps are.
Lamarck's idea of perpetual gradual change made no sense of the obvious adaptation of individual species to particular environments. So sort of stability of species was not adopted for creationist reasons, but simply because that was the best biological explanation. And Cuvier was obviously a very eloquent advocate of that.
Jean-Baptiste was an Italian geologist who studied Italian fossils, particularly those that he found in the sub-Apennine hills. What he did was collect data from the modern Adriatic Sea, where modern species were living, and compare them with his data from tertiary fossils. What he found was that about 50% of the species were still living. We could say that Brocchi had a third way to the history of species, which was separate and distinct from Lamarck's and Cuvier's.
First of all, he says it's kind of pointless, though, to just study the shells on the modern beaches, except that tells you what's alive now, and you can match them up with the fossils that he's got. But he also said, likewise, it's a waste of time, basically, to go to the older rocks and study genealogies of species, I guess he said, now long since gone, that have nothing to do with understanding the origin of the modern species. The famous thing that Brockie said was that species are like individuals. They have births and deaths through natural causes. He also felt that species do not change particularly, so the ideas of Lamarck, if you look at species in the fossil record through some layers, obviously the passage of time, you never find what Lamarck was predicting that you should find. And basically the species are the species.
It seems more and more that there were lots of other theories and speculations floating around internationally in the early 19th century for other kinds of natural explanation of species origins. I think there's very, very little evidence for a belief in sort of real sudden creation from nothing, as it were, a new species. I don't think any serious thinker adopted that. Most of them said, no, but, well, it's a mystery.
Those are the watchwords for the beginnings of modern evolutionary theories, to come up with a natural causal explanation for the origin of the species that we have around us today. And so everybody thought, well, the fossils would be important for this. And the best and most easily collected fossils for this purpose are mollusks. Not fossil bones and stuff. It's very rare you get enough of that material.
Think about those questions, why don't I try writing about them? I think that long-term perspectives are really valuable generally, and I think that's one of the main things historians of science have to offer. Geology was such a new science in the early 19th century and really exciting for people, for one thing. It's almost hard for us to imagine now how the very idea of going out and collecting fossils or doing field work was something people just fired up their kind of idea that, this would be a chance to see big landscapes, it would be a chance to explore the wilds of nature. So that when it came, for example, to the Geological Society of London, was it going to be called a mineralogical society, or was it going to be called a geological society? Geology had this much broader sense of studying the entire Earth and its past history. So there was this kind of idea that geology was romantic from that point. It promised a kind of cosmic understanding of the depths of what went on in the Earth, the past of the human race, the past indeed of the entire planet. And this was something you could get through to geology. So even today, for practicing geologists, they often have a kind of, the reason they study the subject, the reason they love it, the reason they enjoy looking at fossils or understanding the past, has many of the emotional components that we would identify as effectively being romantic. If you would have gone to Darwin's back garden at Shrewsbury, they had a little chemical lab in the back of their house, and there they analyzed minerals, and Darwin had his own mineral collection, a little cabinet of his own. He was really interested. He was interested in the first memory he has that he relates to natural history of is picking up stones. So Darwin is quite interested in these questions from the beginning, and it's an interest that really takes off in Edinburgh.
The next thing I can see in the story, though, is the review of Brockie's monograph by Leonard Horner, who was a geologist, British geologist, actually Scottish geologist. He says, systems are speculative, and I'm not going to basically bore the reader or trouble the reader with repeating Brockie's speculations. But then he said he hastened to add that he doesn't realize that the ultimate reason for doing any of this geological or paleontological work is to come up with a system, to try to form an understanding in general, simple terms about what the processes of Earth history and the formation of the fossil record and so on, the history of life, is really all about.
The idea of species as individuals survived in the early 19th century literature, particularly in Scotland, in Edinburgh.
Perhaps in Edinburgh the analogy was already in circulation without even Brockie's name attached any longer to it, so that people were beginning to use the analogy. We know that the book, a copy of the 2 volumes of Subapennine Fossil Conchology, to give it its English translation of 1814, was in the university library.
There was a small group of people in Edinburgh who were called the Edinburgh Lamarckians. One of them was Robert Grant, and the other one was Robert Jamison. They were both physicians teaching at the medical school. These guys turned out to be very important to Darwin, who began being a student in the medical school in 1825.
Well, this is the square where John Berkeley's extramural anatomy school was based. So this would be a very familiar place to many, several generations, in fact, of Edinburgh University medical students. Not only did Knox run the medical school here, but also it was here that Robert Grant taught in John Berkeley's anatomy school. He taught invertebrate biology.
So Robert Grant taught Darwin how to use a light microscope. Grant's whole purpose was, in his research, was to show a direct evolutionary connection between plants and animals. And he was working on bryozoans, meaning moss animals, but also on corals, things like that, and sea anemones and sponges. They were regular companions, and Lord knows what they spoke about when they went back and forth walking to Firth of Forth. But Darwin writes in his autobiography, when he was in his 60s, he said, well, one day when we were walking, I was astonished that Robert Grant burst into a paean of praise of Lamarck, and saying that Lamarck was right and life had evolved, but he was quite passionate apparently. And Darwin said, well, it didn't have any effect on me. I think just quite the opposite is true, though. I think that that was a very big event, and it was big enough for him to mention it. Guy who was a teacher of Darwin was Robert Jamison. He taught a course or gave some lectures, nobody knows for sure what it was, on the origin of the animal species, and Darwin was known to attend them.
Robert Jamison, I think, is a neglected Scottish scientist who's been overshadowed by Darwin and other notable figures, and perhaps his reputation suffered at the hands of Darwin. His museum was in the left-hand corner there, the upper left-hand corner, and it would be pretty much contemporaneous with Jamison himself, his tenure as professor.
So I did a PhD on the history of geology in India at the School of Oriental and African Studies.
We've got a latte here.
That's
There you are.
I went through his correspondence one day to try and find out, that they kept an animal in the Natural History Museum.
Yeah,
Jamison.
yeah.
But there's been a lot of controversy about exactly what species the animal.
I thought that was a myth. I didn't realise that.
Oh no, it's absolutely true.
Is it true?
And it's in the engraving, live animals hiding under the display cases. And I think Jamison says in one of his letters that at least one of the animals was an ocelot.
And he spent hours in the museum in Edinburgh, Robert Jamison's museum, which was a fantastic collection of fossils and minerals. Jamison was a pioneer in introducing field work into British geology for students, and so the students actually got some real hands-on experience.
In a footnote to the introduction of his Systems of Mineralogy, 1804, Robert Jamison laid out the main problems of natural history as he saw them as the 19th century began. For Jamison, the most important questions included: were all animals and plants originally created as we at present find them, or have they by degrees assumed the specific forms they now possess? This is the first question he mentions. He's identified the succession of species in the geological record as a problem that needs to be addressed. And he talks about transformism as a possible solution to this problem in 1804.
And if you read their things, now nobody published under their own name, there are two famous or becoming famous anonymous essays that were published in Jamison's journal, were both deeply evolutionary in nature. And it's very interesting to see there's a mixture of both Lamarckian elements, the gradual change through time, but Brocchi was equally there too, the analogy particularly. So that and Brocchi's notion that there's an internal limit to the age of species. One of the most important things, however, was in Jamison's book. He had a translation of Cuvier's Revolutions on the Surface of the Globe. I mean, there's just 4 pages of tables of species within genera and genera within families in the fossil record, and clearly showing that some genera go extinct before others. Species go extinct, but sometimes the genus keeps going. How does that happen? Well, it happens because there's a new species there that takes its place.
Stefano, I have held in my hands the 2 volumes of the Sub-Apennine Conchologia, and it's a beautiful book, a contemporary binding. And when I asked the librarians, is there evidence that Darwin could have read this book, we looked at the register of library borrowings, the volumes for each year which listed books borrowed by students or consulted by students. And the very period that Darwin was in Edinburgh, that volume of the register of borrowings was missing and has been missing for a long time, for reasons I do not wish to speculate on. Given the fact that he read widely, it's a reasonable supposition to presume that he consulted it, at least.
In the 19th century, the scientists were very careful to show they were using the correct inductive method. That's just you collected data, and the theory then emerged from that. So what Darwin didn't want to do was suggest that he'd been influenced by other people's theories, which were seen as being very speculative, not really based on evidence. He wanted to show that the theory had emerged, his theory of evolution had emerged from the evidence. So it was in his interest to downplay any influence these speculative ideas had had in his youth. And that's the reason I think perhaps he has little to say about Edinburgh.
His lectures were so boring, Darwin said later in life, that I determined never to take up the study of geology again. And of course the first thing he did when he got on the Beagle was to decide he was going to write the geological history of South America. So I mean, so he's saying Jamison had no effect on him, and Jamison had an enormous effect on him. Darwin's father, I think he loved his children and everything, but he was getting tired of Darwin doing all of this other things in medical school. So he said, you still need a profession, my boy, and you shall become a clergyman in the Church of England. And for that, I'm sending you to Cambridge where you can get your degree. he gathered up two more mentors. He got particularly John Stevens Henslow, who, like Lamarck, I think he was a crystallographer at first, but he got the job in botany at Cambridge, founded the botanical gardens, became a companion. He was the man who walked with Henslow. Henslow was very interested in variation. Henslow, both of within a species in a local place, but also across the countryside.
And since I retired from teaching at Tree University, it's getting to be 10 years now. Pretty much since then, I began to work on a project that I was very passionate about, and that was to publish Darwin's scientific manuscripts. There was something unusual about the Henslow sheets in that very commonly they would have more than one plant on a page. It becomes quite clear that he has a view of what he's doing himself as a botanist, and that is looking for the limits of variation within a species in order to define a species. Now he was a creationist. He was also very religious, but he was a creationist and thought that species have a reality, and the various forms that are produced are definitely part of the reality, but there's a limit beyond which they don't go. They don't change. Now that is something that Darwin was taught by Henslow, who actually took Henslow's course 3 years in a row.
The other person who was at Cambridge who was extremely important to Darwin was Adam Sedgwick, who was the proctor, sort of the fierce, and he was an anti-evolutionist. He had trained himself to be a geologist, and by the time Darwin was there in the late 1820s, he was emerging as one of the great geologists of Great Britain. So here's another self-taught person with outstanding work ethics, and Sedgwick and Henslow, they just worked all the time. There were also philosophers there. I think Whewell was there. Herschel was passing through. Darwin got to know most of the cognoscenti, most of the leading lights in thinking scientifically in Britain, particularly when he went over to Cambridge. Herschel was this philosopher, was pushing the importance of Newton for all of science, basically. And he had written this book in 1830, which is one of my favorite books. It's probably the earliest coherent book on the philosophy of science. It's basically hypothetico-deductive, how you do science. And he said that book and a book by von Humboldt were the two books that convinced him that he should actually go into science.
Initially, when he was there, I think he became quite interested, especially in botany and in collecting insects, which were his main interest. But he did go to at least some of Adam Sedgwick's lectures, that's quite clear. And it was part of his general reputation as being a kind of young philosopher, as it was called.
Henslow told Professor Sedgwick that he wished that he would take Darwin out into the field in Wales, where he was doing his field work, geological field work. That must have been remarkable, because I think it lasted only a week, and I don't know if that includes travel time to get out there. And apparently they split up during the day after 1 or 2 days in the field together to cover more territory, and they would get together in the evening and chat about what they had seen and get into arguments. And I thought that was amazing that Sedgwick thought so highly of this young man and his abilities as a geologist, and my God, he had some wonderful abilities that later comes out, that he trusted Darwin, and he also listened to his arguments if Darwin would start disagreeing. This is all in the time of 1 week. It's just kind of astonishing to me. Anyway, it was a successful week, and Darwin's house, his family house, was in Shropshire, and that's near the Welsh border, apparently. I've never been there. And so Darwin got there, and when he got there, he found a letter from Henslow inviting him to be the companion to Robert Fitzroy on the Beagle, and also to serve informally as the ship's naturalist